Well, hello. We're working on American history. We're on chapter 8. We're going to be looking at pages 138 to page 154. I'm going to take a look at this and see what it has to say for us. It's called The Federalist Years, 1789 to 1801, and it has three sections: launching the new government, emerging political parties, and declining Federalist influence. And we're going to cover all those in the next few minutes. Um, I've talked a lot in previous tapes about how much I like this book, and I still do. But part of that is because so far it's agreed with my own points of view so much. But in this chapter, it begins to diverge a little bit, and um, and that's fine. People have a point of view, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. But I wanted to point out a couple of things that show what what their underlying point of view is, so that you can make up your own mind about how to take it and where you want to go with it. It's entirely up to you what you think. Um, on page 139 in the introduction, it has this closing sentence. It says, "Forces for decentralization had limited government, and limited government would blunt the national thrust, sparking controversy and conflict." And the way it says that, it makes it clear that the writers of this book believed that the central government was a good idea. It uses words like blunt the national thrust, and that point of view is what sparked the controversy and conflict. That if everybody had just going along with the Federalist view, there wouldn't be any controversy. So you can see how what their point of view is, and maybe it's a valid point of view. I don't happen to share it, but I have long ago given up the idea that I know everything and that my views are always right. Um, it goes on to talk about the launching of the new government. It mentions Henry Knox being the Secretary of War, and that's one of the people of that time that I'm interested in and follow, because I was born in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is in Knox County, both of which were named for that man. So he sparks my interest. And I hope that you find people, real people during this time, that for whatever reason spark your interest, and you dig a little deeper into who they were and what they were about, because these were real people, and they're interesting people, and in many cases heroic and courageous people and thoughtful people, and I think they're worth looking at. Um, it talks about the Supreme Court and how it kind of got off to a shaky start in terms of its influence, and there's a room in the building of the bottom, the basement of the Capitol building, that they used to start with. And when I visited the Capitol, oh my goodness, it's been 40 years ago now, that there was a sign on the door in the basement of the Capitol where they met, and I found that was interesting. I don't know whether it's still there or not. A lot of time has gone by. It talks a lot about taxes and the government borrowing money. Um, I want to be transparent about the way I believe, so that you can make up your mind whether I know what I'm talking about in these particular areas or not. But I think it's a mistake for governments to be allowed to go into debt at all. Um, uh, I believe that governments going into debt is taxation without representation. Uh, if you're a student, you have not had a chance to vote yet. And yet the debts that have been accumulated by our government are something that you're going to have to pay. So that means that you're being taxed without having had opportunity to be represented. And I believe that to be reprehensible. So that's just my point of view. I mentioned last time about the Bill of Rights. I wanted you to pay attention to them and see if there's any that you would have added or changed had you been involved in the creating of the Bill of Rights. Um, I hope you've given that some thought and have reasons for what you've decided. I have a couple of changes that I would have liked to have made had I been in charge. And one of them is that I would have put something in place to limit the power of the political parties, basically to make sure that the representatives would be representatives statewide. So, like in Tennessee, we have, I think, 11 representatives. I would have had that been a statewide election, and the top 11 people would have gone. And that would mean like the top one would be a Democrat or Republican, the second one would be the other one, whichever one the first one wasn't. But then the other nine would represent other communities of interest in the state. Most political parties, in most elections, no political party gets more than 20% of the voter electorate. There's a lot of people that just don't vote. They vote independent, that have given up on the electoral process altogether because there's no political party that represents them. And I believe that we'd be a lot better off if everybody was part of the process. And I believe they would be part of the process if they had an actual opportunity to vote for somebody that represented them and their point of view. Um, so I would have limited the power of the political parties in that way. The other one is that I would not have given Congress the power to decide how much it gets paid. The people in Congress should be paid uh, based on what the legislature of their particular state decides to pay them. They can just take how much ever money they want, and if their salaries were dependent on the particular state legislatures, I think they would do a much better job of representing the state that they come from instead of the party that they come from. But this is my point of view. Another place where the point of view of the book is uh, revealed is in the discussion of Hamilton's plans. On the bottom of page 141, the first paragraph of the Hamilton plans, it says, although his critics accused him of trying to centralize government even further, well, his critics were right. That's exactly what he was trying to do. But when they say it like that, it sounds like that it's an invalid criticism. And when in fact it was quite valid. That's exactly what he was trying to do. And he thought it was a good idea. Maybe it was a good idea, but that's beside the point. The point is that you need to be careful when you're reading material or listening to me to realize everybody has an agenda, everybody has a point of view, everybody has a way they believe, and you need to recognize that and analyze it, not just take in whatever information people give you. You need to think it through for yourself. Um, oh, I have a note here I can't read. Um, oh, it's talking about Washington, D.C., how Washington, D.C. Became the capital of our nation. I think I mentioned last time I much prefer the way the Swiss did it. They divide up their capital. They divide up their government between different cities, so one city doesn't become too influential in the life of the nation. By that I mean the judiciary would be in one city, the legislature in another. In our case, we could have the Senate in one place and the House of Representatives in another, and then the executive branch would be spread out, maybe a different secretary of the cabinet in a different city, so something like that. They talk about the interpretation of the Constitution, the loose constructionists and the strict constructionist. And you can read about that on page 143. I hope you read it carefully and think through what do you think in terms of what is the best way to interpret the Constitution, loosely or strictly. And I have a mixed view of that in terms of what the federal government itself should do, like establishing a national bank. I would favor a loose interpretation. But when it's talking about what power the federal government has over state governments, I would favor a strict construction. So I have mixed views. This is sort of common with me. I very seldom find um, political parties or groups of people with which I agree with all their points of view. One example of that would be the early political parties. You have a student activity on page 37 about that. I encourage you to go through it and give some thought to what would you be? Which one of those parties would you be if you were at that lived in that time? And I have to say I would have been, the Democratic Republican, but I disagree with a couple of the things they wanted to do. Um, I the Federalists um, wanted to make it where only people with wealth and education could vote. But I, to some extent, I agree with the idea of only educated people vote. Um, People that pass some kind of test about the ability to think logically and knowing certain amounts of information. Unfortunately, they actually did try that in many of the states in the early years. And what happened was the um, uh, the literacy test became something they could use to exclude the other party. They would have people in charge of it, and if they didn't like you, you failed the test, and if they liked you, you did, even if you were completely uneducated. Today we have computers, and we might be able to come up with a way to do it where the computer did not know who was taking the test and would be able to assess a person's education objectively. So I would like to see something like that come up. Um, they talk about how the different parties take control of the different branches of the government. I think we're always better served when the different branches are under the control of different parties. Right now, the executive and the Senate are under the control of the Democratic Party, and the um, House of Representatives and the Supreme Court are under the control of the Republicans. And I like that very much because it's split up. And that forces them into compromise. They can't just do whatever they want. Um, there can always be a voice of dissent raised without fear. And so things are discussed until we come together on what maybe perhaps the best thing to do is. Um, I really like the paragraph on it's on page 144 where it talks about Washington at the end of the first section. It says, for his part, Washington deplored political parties. He, I see the problem. I don't have my glasses on. He embodied the nonpartisan attitude to public office that had been the founder's ideal. His dismay, therefore, was profound when he discovered that political divisions that would shake up the government began in his own cabinet. I think it's terrible the way our politicians are so partisan to their own party instead of thinking about what's best for the nation. Um, and this chapter has several examples of how um, George Washington exemplified what what he did that made people call him the father of our nation. For instance, when he was thinking about running for the second time, and Jefferson reminded him that North and South will hang together if they have you to hang on to. On page 145. Um, that's the kind of thing that made people call him the father of our country because he's the one who held things together. Um, on the next page, it talks about the Proclamation of Neutrality, which Washington, in a young nation, it was very important that we remain neutral for as long as possible, so that we could get our own problems in hand before we started dealing with the international scene. And he had the vision to see that. Uh, we see the case of Citizen Gannett coming in and trying to interfere in our politics. That's something that we'll always face. If you are aware of the news at all, you know that Russia and China are both heavily involved with trying to have an influence in our politics through various agencies and methods. And probably every country on earth has some agents here trying to do something, but those are the big ones. Um, so we need to be aware of that and not be easily led astray by the propaganda that they might be putting out. Um, don't believe lies. Don't believe propaganda. Don't be led into thinking a certain way by somebody else. Think for yourself. Find the facts yourself. Make your own decisions. Um, Another reason George Washington was father of our country in the Whiskey Rebellion, he was the only president that personally led troops while in office as a president. Um, just, you probably realized already he's a man that really impresses me. I'm a man that I admire. It talks about Daniel Boone and his exploits. I had a friend when I was going to school that was actually related in some way to Daniel Boone. But once again, that's not really meaningful. Interesting, but not meaningful. All of us are related to somebody that lived during this time that did something. Otherwise, you wouldn't exist. You have many ancestors that were living during this time. I found it interesting to go back, my wife and I both, to go back and try and figure out who some of those people were. And it was a lot of fun, but maybe that's not something that interests you. Washington's farewell address is brought up on the bottom of page 148. You have a student activity on pages 35 and 36 that talks about that. I encourage you to go through that carefully. Um, And interesting thing about his speech is that it significantly influenced, this is on page 149, significantly influenced America's basic foreign policy until the world wars of the 20th century. Um, another another reason that he's called the father of our country. Talks about John Adams. That's another man that I deeply admire. Um, he was a Federalist, and uh, there were a lot of things that he believed and did that I don't particularly agree with. But one of the things that was really amazing about him was that regardless of how he saw things, he consistently made decisions and led in a way that was what he believed was best for the whole country, not best for his party. And if we just had leaders like that today, we would have significantly fewer big problems. Um, John Adams was one of the first people that um, I ever uh, learned about as an individual person. When I was in high school, I read a biography of John Adams, and I found it very interesting. Um, you have a student activity about him on page 38 in your student activity book. Once again, I encourage you to look at that. Um, and here's the quote in the book that outlines why I admire him so much. Few presidents have made decisions with less concern for their own political future than Adams. We need more men like that. Even though he's a man whose point of view I didn't particularly agree with, I admire him so much. Um, and then this period of history is when they started building ships for the U.S. Navy. Um, one of the ships that they built, what called the USS Constitution, um, or as it came to be called, was Old Ironsides. This was another book that I read when I was a teenager. Was about Old Ironsides. I got to visit the ship itself one time when I was in Boston. It sits in Boston's harbor. It's the oldest commissioned ship in the Navy. Once a year on July 4th, they take it out, sail it around, and it's kind of amazing. It's not as big as I would have thought it was. It's called Old Ironsides because in a battle somebody saw a cannonball bounce off the side of it. Um, that it's not that strong. It that wouldn't have happened unless the cannonball had already slowed down considerably, having been shot from a very long distance away. But it was an amazing ship because it was a big technological advance for its time. The hull was built in what they call a bias, and which was the beginning of the a technology advance called clipper ships. I don't know whether the book covers them later or not, but clipper ships were significantly more maneuverable and faster than other ships at the time. And so Old Ironsides, uh, she fit in a niche. Um, there were a lot of ships that had more guns and were more powerful, but they were slower. And but she had more guns than other ships that were kind of her same size. So either she could outrun or outshoot any ship she ran into, which made her kind of remarkable and led to a lot of technological advances in naval warfare. Um, and another note that I can't read, it says, oh yeah, it was talking about the Alien and Sedition Acts and how they were trying to use them to suppress free speech. And I know a lot of people talk about that now. They're trying to suppress free speech as if this was a new thing. People, uh, it's just your nature that after a while you get tired of listening to people that talking about things that you disagree with, and you kind of just wish they'd shut up. And this is not a good thing. You need to listen. I've never learned anything from people that already agree with me. And I believe learning is very important. And you don't learn things from people that already think the same way you do. If you want to learn something, you need to talk with somebody that disagrees with you because there must be some reason for the difference in what you believe. I'm not saying that you should give too much credence for them or visit a satanic church in order to learn something more, but to seek out why people have different points of view is an education in itself, and I encourage you to do that. Um, see what this is. Hmm. Oh, it's talking about Jefferson retired to Monticello and John Adams to Quincy. Um, Massachusetts, and how they died on the same day, and how they became friends after they'd been enemies. And um, to me, that embodies the very thing I'm talking about um, spending time talking with people that disagree with. They're human beings just like us. They're made in the image of God, and they deserve our respect, and they deserve a respectful listening, even if we never agree with what they have to say. Um, on pages 39 and 40 in your student activities, there's something that will prepare you for your test for the chapter. I hope that you do well. And until we meet again, God bless you.